So the household materials that I asked you to assemble, I'd like for you to get those ready now. So to just put a towel underneath, because we are going to be working with water and that'll help to absorb. I like to use bar soap with a grater. Part of that is because it allows me to see more clearly how much soap I've put on and when I've applied it. As well, I'm half Italian and I honor my heritage as if it's Parmesan cheese. I use a name brand that has no added ingredients. You can also use olive oil, soap, whatever your preference is, and be aware of any sensitivity you might have to skin. We're also going to be using a towel to aid in the rolling, and I'll show you how we do that first. So when we get to that point in the process. So the first thing I'd like you to do is lay down one of your towels, and then you should have two pieces of plastic. Again, this can be just a grocery store bag that is cut to the same size, and that's important because as we lay out, if one is smaller than the other, it can become difficult as you're applying the water and rolling it up. And the first piece of plastic should just be laid down on the towel, and the second piece of plastic laid on top of it. But we're going to roll that up now because we're not going to use it in this moment, and we want to get it out of the way, but have it close at hand because that's where we're going to use it. So, as mentioned before, the wool can come in various forms, roving of different kinds, whether it's full bat or loose hairs or roving that is typically used for spinners. And the first thing I'd like you to do is to get this into a manageable state for you to handle it. So, for example, if it's a very long piece, that's probably more than you can manage. So we want to get it to a length of about 18 inches or an arm's length so that it's something that is easier to handle. The other thing, and please notice that if you are using roving like this and you go to break it, you can't tear this open. And this is one of the beautiful life lessons of felting. When you're struggling, let go. Just relax and release. So if you notice that if you just get really tender and really loose, then you can break it. So if you've got a tight grip on life, let it go and loosen up and allow what unfolds, because you'll be beautifully surprised. So we want to get this into a manageable state. And now this length is manageable, but it might be a little bit too thick because the objective is to have more than one layer, 2 or 3 layers for this small piece that we'll be making. And we want those layers to be even. And if it's this full density, it will be harder for us to felt and take longer. So we can also divide this vertically like that. So let's divide that vertically and put it, and we'll of course be using this as well, but we can just put it to the side. As we get involved with the soap and water, I just want to bring to your attention that you want to dry your hands if your hands become wet so that you're not handling the loose fibers with wet hands, because that will make it more difficult to manage. So as long as it's about the width of your hand, and enough that you can almost see through it. And the way I have found is easiest to actually pull out the fibers is pretend that you're in Italy and you're waving. This is how the Italians wave. Ciao, ciao. And you place those fibers right where the crease is in your hand, and then clasp your fist around it gently, and then you pull. And you see how nice and thin and even that layer is. And that's what we're going to start to lay out on our plastic. You want to keep about a 2-inch margin around the edge of the plastic, because as we add the soap and water, these fibers will continue to splay out. And in order to, again, shorten the time necessary, we're going to start everything in one direction. So you can see that in this case, these fibers are vertical. And so I'm going to put just a slight overlap next to the piece I just put down so that there's not going to be a hole. And yet we're continuing to have this beautiful, fine, thin, and even layer step by step across the piece of plastic until we get to the edge. And what I may do for the next layer is I'll switch colors so that you can see it more easily, because I've got white on white. So again, now this roving is much thinner than the other piece, so I'm just going to break it to a manageable length, but it isn't going to be necessary to thin it out again vertically, because it's pretty thin already. So as I go into the second row, I am again taking those fibers, putting them in the crease of my hand, folding my wrist over it, and gently pulling so that I have a nice thin layer. And now I'm going to create a little overlap on that first row and just follow along. A little bit of overlap side by side and a little bit of overlap to the first row as I'm applying the second row. This can also be your choice to switch up the colors based on your design. So what you're seeing here will be the underlayer, and it will show up on the underside. So that's what we're trying to do. And of course, I've done this for a long time. So if your layers aren't quite as thin or quite as even, that's okay. I want you to know that you can't do this wrong. Just relax into this beautiful creative process and allow the fibers to help you. And so I'm going to make a third row, which will still allow me to have a nice 2-inch margin around the edges. And I'm still overlapping to the second row as well as side by side for the row I'm creating. Now, you can also decide that you want the shape to be a triangle or a heart or round. That's at your discretion as well, but I'm just going to do a rectangle here to show the process. So now my first layer has been put down, and I have a nice thin layer, and now all of those fibers are going vertically. So the second row, I'm going to lay them horizontally. So just like the first, we're going to take that roving, place it in our hands like I mentioned, and gently tug. Now I'm going to lay it horizontally. And the fibers of wool are like watercolors, actually, that the color at the end, as the end result, will either be transparent or opaque, depending on how we lay it out. So if, for example, I wanted this to be a white stripe on the top of my piece, then there isn't any other color to bleed through. But as I lay the white on the second row, then during the process of felting, some of these gray fibers are going to come through because they all intertwine. And so you'll know that it's not going to be as stark white as that row with just white on it. And that's something to think about in your design. And I will continue to lay out the fibers in a thin, overlapping, and sometimes I might end up with just a little bit, and I'll put that off to the side. So I'm continuing to do the layout. Edge to edge, a little bit of overlap, keeping my 2-inch margin all the way around the edges to allow for the splaying that will occur with the water. And I'll finish off the last row. So this is, for the purposes of this particular cloth, just a tablecloth, this is thick enough. We won't need another layer because of the thickness of the fibers. If we were building the walls for a ger in Mongolia, they would pile the wool this high. They measure it this way. So they would layer enough to reach the top of their thumb. I had the honor and blessing to be invited to Mongolia by their Department of Labor to help create women's cooperatives in the act of felting. So it was quite an honor. All right, so now we have a layout. Now we can do all kinds of design with this, and you can use yarns. You can lay in yarns and make a design. For the purpose of this introductory class, I'm using only yarns that are made of wool because it will adhere much easier. It's not that you can't use synthetics, of course you can, but it takes longer and a little bit more guidance. So that is an example of a design you might choose to make. You could also, if you had some curly locks and you wanted to include them, you certainly can. what you want to be aware of again is the multitudes of hairs in these curls. So you want to thin them out enough that they can actually grab on. So I might just put some curly locks in there to give some contrast and design element. And if you were also going to use some of the silk fibers, now the silk fibers, again, are very shiny, and they're going to be stark white, and they don't have barbs on them. So as you're laying any silk fibers out, again, you want to be aware and cognizant that you don't want it to be too thick. Like if I put this big blob in there, the wool just wouldn't be able to grab all that. So we want to make it into a nice fine addition, and that will give us a stark, shiny contrast to the fibers that have already been laid down. And oh, this is the beautiful part of painting with wool, which is what we're doing. Like this didn't go exactly where I wanted it, so I just pick it up and move it. When I was doing watercolor, I was teaching myself to do watercolor. You know, you put a stroke down and you don't want it there, and it's like, oh, now how do I fix that? Well, that is the freedom of working with the wool fibers and painting with wool. If you don't like, you're looking at it, it's pretty much going to look like this at the end. If you don't like what you see, just gently pick up and move it and say, oh no, I'm going to try something else. Let me try it this way. And just play and enjoy, and you know, there's no wrong answer. It's so beautiful. And it's a tactile meditation, really, to become present and just feel the beautiful sensations of the fibers and allow them to express themselves while we express ourselves in this beautiful co-creation. You might decide that you wanted to use one of those silk hankies if you had one of those. And so again, what we would do is we would want to thin it out. The edges especially tend to be very thick. So I generally will, unless for a design reason I wanted to keep it dense, and just spread out those fibers. So this is one of those silk cocoons that has been stretched and dyed into what we call a silk hanky. And let's say for the purpose of this illustration that I wanted to put it in my piece. And so again, as I mentioned, what's going to happen is these wool fibers will come through and grab on, and so you're going to lose some of the color in this, and you probably aren't going to see that curly lock. So you want to decide, where do you want it? You can also tear this into pieces. So if you didn't want the whole thing, you can just gently tear it apart. Again, if it's giving you a hard time, don't struggle, just loosen your grip and stretch it. So let's say I'm going to put that here. So you can see now how that design will look. So I'm just using this as an illustration to give you a visual about contrast and layout. And now I want to show you how to put the water and soap on.